Welcome, everyone. I'm Ellie Arnold. I'm the training coordinator at STEMCELL Network, and we're happy to be hosting this session today. I'm just going to start with a couple housekeeping notes. The session will be recorded and available on YouTube, and there will be lots of time for question and answer at the end of the presentation. And when we reach the question and answer session, you can either raise your hand and I'll unmute you so you can ask your question live, or you can put your question in the Q&A chat box, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen. And we'll address as many questions as possible in the time available, which will be about 20 minutes. And please remember to keep your questions brief and general so that everyone attending can benefit from the answers. So with that, I'd like to officially welcome everyone to today's Job Hunt Like a Pro webinar. In case you're not familiar with the STEMCELL Network, we're a nonprofit organization supporting research in stem cells and regenerative medicine. We hold a wide range of training and education events each year and also have our yearly conference, the Till and McCullough meetings, which will be in Vancouver this year. We originally designed this webinar today to support the Career Connect job fair, which is happening at TMM coming up in Vancouver in just a couple of weeks. But we quickly realized that these topics would be of interest to anyone who's planning to start their job search and trying to figure out how to best present themselves at a career fair or in a job interview. So whether you're a first-year grad student just starting to plan ahead for the job market, or you're a senior postdoc trying to figure out how to move into industry, or anywhere in between, or maybe you even already have a career in industry, this session will leave you with some valuable strategies to land your next role. And I'd like to encourage everyone here who will be at TMM to attend the Career Connect event, which will be held Monday, October 3rd at 3:35 p.m. in the Georgia Ballroom. And this will be a fantastic opportunity to act on the advice you'll gain in the webinar today. And we'll be bringing together actively recruiting companies as well as principal investigators from all across Canada. So with that, I'll introduce today's speakers. We're fortunate to have joining us Christine Genge, who's the Associate Director of Global Talent Acquisition at STEMCELL Technologies, and Tianna Beharriell, who's the Scientific Recruiter at STEMCELL Technologies. So thank you very much to you both for joining us today, and I'll hand it over to you.
Great. Well, thanks, Ellie. So we're excited to be here. Many of you have probably heard of STEMCELL Technologies before. So we're going to be using a little bit of our background and what we do to talk through, hopefully how to get everybody an amazing career. So do we want to jump to the next slide since I am not driving? We'll see how tech savvy we are here. So we're going to go through some brief introductions about who we are and why are we talking to you today, as well as talk about some specific things about mapping, job searching. And the big thing we're going to emphasize today is research to prepare. We're all great at research in science. How do we apply that to actually getting a job? Some of this will also cover a little bit of the types of jobs you can get in science, because spoiler alert, it's more than just jobs titled scientists, as well as some tips for networking. We have some questions that people have already asked, and there'll be an opportunity for you to ask questions. So if you're thinking of something, please make sure to ask it to us, because it's always more fun to get some live questions. Okay, so who am I and why am I starting out this presentation blabbing to you? So I'm Christine. I currently work as the head of Global Talent Acquisition, which is a really fancy title for we're the team that helps find people jobs and helps the company find the right people for the jobs. We make a lot of that connection. So I am originally from Ontario, even though I am now out in BC. I did my undergrad and my master's degree at Queen's before moving out to the West Coast to do my PhD, and I stayed out here. Now, I was not fortunate enough to do a PhD in something that was directly related to stem cells. I actually did my work looking more at the evolution of contractile proteins in the heart, using things like zebrafish. But that has not stopped me from doing a career in science. And in fact, what you do during your research career, you can very easily translate if you are passionate about science. And that's how I ended up at STEMCELL. I had never used stem cell products, but I had worked on some projects that were probably collaborative with iPSC work. And I was very passionate about talking to people about their research, wanted to work in something with science communication. So they started me in sales, which sales was an amazing point to learn about what we did at STEMCELL, as well as to talk to a lot of really cool scientists doing fascinating work. That wasn't where I wanted to be long term. And the fun part about STEMCELL, and why do I put all of these changes in my job title up here on this slide? It's because I didn't land in the perfect career my first try. I eventually looked into this cool job title that was scientific recruiter that, might say Tianna has, and thought that, you know what? I was a scientist who had no idea what to do with my degree. What if there's other people like me, and how can I help them? So I got very lucky that the HR department looked at me and was like, you have zero experience in HR and you have no idea what you're talking about in recruiting, but maybe we'll give you a try and we'll see if it works. And turned out it did for STEMCELL. We now have a complete scientific recruitment team where we have people who have scientific backgrounds who are trying to help those who also have scientific backgrounds find the right career, and to work with our scientists to find the right people to help them move their projects forward. And that's the function that we built at STEMCELL, which has led me to my current job. So yes, I've changed titles several times, but that's because we've been building a function that works for STEMCELL. And hopefully, since we are talking to the STEMCELL network today, you can see why we are extremely passionate about helping people find their careers. And I'm going to let Tianna jump in now to talk a little bit about how she ended up where she is. And then we'll go more through it.
Well, thanks. Yeah, so I'm Tianna, and really, really excited to be here and talk today. I also don't really come from a traditional background that you might think of when you think of STEMCELL Technologies. But I've been involved in various types of research in everything from ergonomics to physiology to biomechanics for about 10 years before joining STEMCELL. I love research and I love the diversity of research. So all of those skills were really, really important and definitely helped me in my job today. It lets me talk to a number of different people from different backgrounds, which is awesome. A lot of my volunteer work and everything else that I've kind of done throughout my schooling has really been on the marketing, event planning side. I knew I didn't want to stay in the lab. I wanted something that was a little bit more interpersonal. Recruiting was definitely not on my radar, but after some interesting soul searching and finding, okay, how do I combine an interpersonal aspect with, something I can still use my science in? Had some really good conversations with Christine and a couple of the other people on the recruitment team. Really, really excited to see, even in the year and a half that I've been at STEMCELL, the team has grown probably 3 times the size when I joined, which is crazy. But it means that we have a very, very dedicated and passionate network of people who are really enthusiastic about finding and talking about different kinds of careers, both on and off the bench. So I'm originally also from Ontario, went from Windsor all the way up to Ottawa for grad school, so ran the whole gamut of Ontario, and then moved out to Vancouver last year. So loving it out here. And yeah, with that, we'll jump right into the presentation.
Right. So as you've probably heard from both of us already, at STEMCELL, we have a lot of people who get really excited about helping science move forward. And that's a really broad thing to say, but we have a lot of scientists who like to geek out about different things. And you may have seen this line on our website. And I like to start most presentations out with, yeah, at STEMCELL, we're scientists helping scientists. We want to make sure that scientists in life or cell biology or life sciences in general have the right tools to bring their research forward, so that really we can all spend less time troubleshooting and more time answering the really important questions that need to get answered. So at STEMCELL, we do this by making sure we have high quality, innovative reagents and different tools that are going to help workflows move forward. And in order to do that effectively, we often need people with a variety of different backgrounds who work well together. So this is one of the things that I just want to emphasize that we look for at STEMCELL, and that if you're feeling you may see that there are a lot of different ways to fit into this overall mission that we can focus on today, as using stem cell as a sample biotech, let's put it that way, with a variety of different kinds of jobs that scientists can do. So let's skip on to the next slide with why are we here today? So we've already mentioned this, that we are not here today to tell you about all our wonderful products and all the amazing science we support, though it's very cool, and you can definitely come see us if you are coming to TMM this year, and we are more than happy to talk about the latest products as well as how we can support your research. But what our goal here today is to talk more about how you can find the right role for whatever stage in your career you're at. That's our goal in scientific recruitment, is we want to help make that easier, because we know that this isn't something there's necessarily a textbook for that tells you step by step, here's how to get into every individual company, especially because it does seem like a gray box sometimes. Different companies call different positions different things, and the job ad may not tell you everything you need to know. We have a recruitment team, though, that is there to support people, which is also why we're here to talk at events like this, since we understand that there's a lot of big decisions, and that from our part, we are well positioned, since we work with both managers in the company as well as candidates outside the company, to help navigate this sometimes tricky process that's really important, especially if you are excited and very passionate about a particular area of science. We want to make sure we help you get it right, so that you're not left feeling lost, or you're left feeling like you just took a job because you had to. You want to make sure that that's building towards something bigger. Okay. So the first thing we're going to emphasize is that you need to research to prepare for whatever your next career step is. A lot of times it's easy to think about this of, okay, I'm going to finish my PhD, master's, bachelor's, I'm good at all this research, and then I'm going to keep doing the same thing, and it's just going to lead to the next stage. That's not necessarily true. The skills you build at the lab bench are only part of what you're developing during any graduate work or doing any research work. And part of how you're going to understand how to better sell all the skills you've developed is also to make sure you've done the appropriate research to figure out what are those skills and what does industry actually need, because they may be asking for it in a slightly different way than they would if you were going on to a postdoc.
Yeah, so one of the questions that we're often asked is, what do you look for in new candidates in their resumes and their interviews? And that's really dependent on the job itself. When you take a look at your skill set that you've developed over the course of your academic career, one of the top skills that you've undoubtedly developed is research. So looking at job searching methodically and with a purpose is going to really help you to develop a plan for targeting specific industries, companies, and as well regions which align with your values, skills, and interests. The other thing that having a plan really does is also helps you to stay motivated. Job searching can be a full-time job in itself. And especially if you're trying to wrap up your degree while you're doing this, it can be really overwhelming. So this really helps you take a little bit more control of your search, as well as being honest with yourself about not only your strengths, but areas where you may not have as much practical experience. So this really helps you to think about which skills you might want to showcase when you're writing your resume, preparing for interviews, and then how to also talk about the areas where you might not have as much experience, but maybe be able to demonstrate how you might be able to learn those skills another time when you've maybe learned a skill very quickly when you didn't have any prior knowledge going in. Those are all important transferable skills, and we'll talk a little bit more about those later. But really learning all that you can about what a job is actually like from people working in the field is really important. You might already know someone working in that job, or you might know someone that knows someone, which is typically the case. So reaching out to your network itself, so colleagues, supervisors, collaborators, letting them know that you're interested in pursuing a career in industry, and then a rough idea of also when you'd be looking to start that career. The more specific that you can be about the types of careers you're looking for, that's really helpful to the person on the other side. So having that specific ask is really kind of key. And then trying to connect with people who may have followed a similar career path or educational journey. Having something in common is a really great conversation starter. And that'll come kind of in the form of any of these informational interviews, which we'll also talk a little bit more about later as well.
So along with all of this research that you're doing beforehand, it's important to use that research to also figure out how you can highlight the skills that you've developed are actually going to be relevant to that kind of industry you're going into. Because it turns out there's a lot of things that you develop in your academic training beyond just lab skills that are going to be extremely relevant and extremely transferable. Some of the main things we're always looking at include problem-solving abilities. I'm pretty sure that most of you who have worked in research know that not everything works out the first time. And in fact, most of the time, a lot of graduate school is figuring out how to get things to work and maybe ask questions in a different way so that you can come up with something that's hopefully novel. The type of problem-solving abilities and your examples of that really can set you apart from people who haven't done that, who might have only followed a set protocol over and over again. So making sure that you're able to highlight examples of this in a way that might be conducive to a different style of job is really important. The other thing we look for in industry would be aptitude to collaborate. And this comes down to the types of projects that we work on. It's very unlikely that you would be working on a project where you are the sole owner responsible for everything and you take a project from start to finish. You're often working with other subject matter experts who will help to move that project forward faster. And for that reason, we're usually looking for people who like that type of work, who like working as part of a team and have some examples of how to also work through the difficulties that come up when you don't own every aspect of the project. Again, many of you will have experiences like that in the lab bench where you may have had to use techniques that you weren't the only person who knew how to do it. And in fact, someone else might have been the hands on that project. That's really important. And a lot of times it's not even the ones where you were completely in charge of it, that someone else may have had to drive an aspect of that project. It's really important to highlight that because, again, that's indicative of the type of environment that you'd be going into. The third piece that I usually emphasize is also the resourcefulness and resilience. And we talk about this a lot. We've been talking about this a lot because we just went through a pandemic, but really it's how research works. Stuff doesn't work the first time. And you can have great problem solving abilities, but you also have to have the ability to look in different directions, to ask different people, to sometimes just figure something out despite it not being handed to you. And that's what we mean when we talk about someone being resourceful, that can often get you ahead, especially in industry where, again, your career path may not be a direct ladder. You may have to look in other directions. You may have to continue to gather information to take you somewhere different than where you originally thought it would. And of course, the resilience piece is you can't give up the first try. You may not get the job you want the first time, just the same as that experiment may not have worked the first time. You need to apply those skills, and you often need to show us how you have been able to face down adversity and continue forward, even though you've had 6 months to a year of nothing working. Those are great examples to show that you can move beyond that. The final piece is those interpersonal skills that Tianna was talking about. It's really important that you continue to hone your presentation skills as well as your ability to optimize process with other people and to really share that. So again, finding examples and continuing to hone in on these skills, that's what's going to accelerate you ahead. I always tell people that why I'm telling you these things about get a concrete example, because that is your data here. You need to still give us some concrete data that you can do this. And more importantly, sometimes tell us why you took a particular approach and how that would be different than everybody else. Because the fun part of it is there may be 100 people who can all do the exact same technique as you. But if you approach the problem in a slightly different way and that took you ahead, that's the important piece of that beyond just the technical skill.
So the other really important thing is to understand what industry really looks like. And industry isn't this one big giant piece that's outside of academia, and every industry looks slightly different. So really, again, on that researching side of things, you really want to gather as much information as you can about the industries that you might be interested in. This information really helps you speak in an informed way during informational interviews, networking events, and actual interviews. So one thing that I did when I was looking up where I might want to work, and it's really helpful, was building a profile on each industry you might be interested in, knowing who the key players are and what differentiates them. So things like strengths, weaknesses, vision, values, any current trends or advancements in the field. So just as you would when developing a research project, knowing the history and experts in the field are crucial. Do any of those experts have social media, podcasts, et cetera, that you can follow? Those are really going to give you a real-time snapshot of what that might be like in the industry, as well as what's going on in the industry. That's a great talking point to understand where you might be able to get excited about something that's going on recently in a company or in an industry itself.
So we have a couple of recommendations when you are doing research on companies, because you can go down a rabbit hole and you can get a ton of information, and not all of it is going to be relevant, especially at the start of your job search. But the big questions you should come out of any research on a company would be, do you actually want to work for this company? Because sometimes, as Tianna's mentioned, the different kinds of industry aren't for everybody. So when you're asking questions about a company, even through informational interviews, you should be finding out if their values work for you. Some people will want to work in more consultant framework. Other people will want to work for something that has a little bit more stability. Some people will want to work in a more independent driven role versus other people will thrive in a collaborative environment. Either way, you want to make sure that that fits with what you're looking at. There's a lot of information types that can be gathered on it, so don't think it only comes from informational interviews. There's sometimes things in the news. They'll tell you if new sites are being open. You can sometimes see even the types of community engagement different companies are doing. As an example, if you follow, Tianna and I on LinkedIn, you may see that we do things like beach cleanups as a team, because that's really important to us to help sustainability efforts and to help our community keep, BC's beaches beautiful. It's something that we find important as a team, and you can find information out on that before even talking to us. The other big things that when you're doing your research on a company would be role specific. And if you know you want a particular role, you should make sure you meet the requirements. People take a lot of time to fill out those must-haves, and we can attest to this. Hiring managers sometimes spend weeks trying to figure out what exactly they need and making sure they put it in the list. If they've put it as a must-have, it's probably pretty important. And the advantage of doing this during the research phase is sometimes you can start to work through it beforehand to be like, I didn't do any project management training. Perhaps I can take the MyTax course to see if that's something I'm actually interested in before applying for jobs. Okay. We also want to note, though, there are differences between must-haves, required qualifications, and nice-to-haves. So sometimes jobs will list things as this will be an asset. It might not be a make or break, but it's important to figure that out, which is, again, where informational interviews can help. The last piece is, do you actually want that specific job? And this is really important to do your research again on different companies as well as the different kinds of jobs, because sometimes we can all say we want to be a scientist, but the scientist job itself might not be the one that gets you most excited, or it might be, or a scientist at a company that is making a pharmaceutical may not actually be the job you thought it was. You may, in fact, want to do a different kind of scientist job. So don't be afraid to really check into multiple things before coming to the conclusion that this is the exact type of job I want.
Yeah, so to dive into how do you figure that out? We've mentioned this a couple times, so let's talk a little bit about what informational interviews are. So these are really, really specific conversations with someone in your career field of interest who can provide you with the information you might need to launch your career. So if you think of them as key parts to your research gathering process, they're usually about 20 to 30 minutes. That's pretty standard. Um, and thinking really about what might you not know about the company, industry, or job. So in what you've done in your research so far, you can probably identify that there might be a couple of gaps. So using these interviews as targeted approaches to help you understand those gaps. Um, and then really challenge yourself to think critically about assumptions that you may be making. Like Christine mentioned, working as a scientist in a pharmaceutical company is going to look different than a scientist working in a biotech company. And even within biotech, scientist roles in one company might look entirely different on a day-to-day sort of basis than in another company. So really understanding what that looks like, what skills are most useful, what maybe they might wish that they had done before they got into that job to prepare and help them succeed. Those are all really good questions. So asking open or clarifying questions rather than yes or no are going to help you get the most information out of these kinds of opportunities. So things like, what kinds of technical skills would someone need to be successful in this role versus do I need this skill for this role/company? Learning about the company culture, finding out what people like the most and what people don't like. And while it should be an informal sort of conversation, coming prepared with good questions in mind will definitely help you. Asking the person whether they would mind if you took notes throughout. Otherwise, taking the time after to really summarize any of the key learnings immediately after while the conversation is still fresh in your mind. And maybe noting 1 to 2 kind of really surprising things or really unique things, different things that you might have talked to this person about that might trigger your memory in the future if you're doing a lot of these kind of interviews. Having a general folder that you keep track of all of these, it's a really helpful tool.
All right, so as we're, talking about doing your own research, we're also going to go through some of the types of jobs that you can find in a biotech like stem cell. So we are going to use stem cell specific wording, but we're going to talk more about the groupings of jobs that you could be looking for. Because again, the first job you look at might not be your eventual home. And again, why I got into scientific recruiting is there's a lot of really cool science jobs out there that aren't apparent at first and that you might not know coming out of academia. So the first thing is, where do product ideas actually come from? And why are we talking about this, even though we told you we weren't going to talk as much about products? It's basically because there's a lot of different factors that go into us developing any product. We need to first identify a need in the research community. We need to figure out who's going to use that product, what features are going to be needed, and what's the final product? What is it going to do? This means that there might be a lot of different specialists that go into the development of any one product, as well as we need to do a lot of market research. And in order to fully understand that, we need scientists involved in this portion as well. The other thing that you'll notice is for any technology to move forward, it's not just research and development. There needs to be scientists across the entire workflow internally before anything gets externally. And we also need people who are strong at collaborations with different labs, with different tech transfer offices, you name it, we need to be connected. So when we're looking for the types of jobs, we have to think broader in terms of where people are going to use their skills even within the company. So let's skip on to the next slide. So how do we end up doing this? Well, new product opportunities can come from many different areas. Some of them can come from literature. And when I'm talking literature, I could be the general idea or, wow, everybody's really struggling with this. This technique is taking everybody years. That kind of seems like a waste of time. Can we do it better? The same thing is you may be talking to scientists from industry at conferences and you can let them know where your pain points are and they're going to bring them back. And we're going to use our stem cell expertise to help develop something new. That happens a lot. The other thing, though, that happens and why we put collaborations here are sometimes labs come up with great solutions that are amazing, but they still can't really be shared between labs because there's so much work that goes into creating that media or creating those basic tools that need to be qualified. And that's where STEMCELL can come in and smooth that path out. That again requires people to look at problems in a slightly different way. They may be within research and development, they might be within business development, sometimes they're even in sales that they're going to see these opportunities. The big piece that happens both within research and development, process development, I'm throwing these key terms out for a reason, is the actual development, testing, and optimization of new products. And then the launch. A lot of different groups are involved before you get that beautiful bottle of media that comes out of STEMCELL that you can then grow your cells in. And this involves the typical scientist positions, which might be in research and development or process development, but it also involves a lot of groups like procurement, knowing where the raw materials are coming from and making sure they're of appropriate quality. Manufacturing, making sure the pieces go together in the right order. And again, making sure they're done in the right way, as well as a lot of our quality teams, since we want to make sure that anybody who gets the end product knows it's going to work, as well as groups like marketing who need to be involved earlier than just putting a shiny label on it to make sure that it is heading towards the right people. Of course, part of this process or product development as well includes it's not always done. We get it out to the people who need it, and we want to make sure we get feedback. And sometimes that feedback is it's being used in a slightly different way than originally intended, or another piece is needed to add on because that workflow is going to continue further. Sometimes that brings it all back that we need to improve and innovate. And this is sometimes where you'll see stem cell products that start with a group who is using it for research use only, and they know they're going preclinical. So we need to move with them and we need to develop a product in a new way. But the big take home message is there are a lot of people involved at STEMCELL or any biotech to make sure that we're effective in bringing people the tools they need. So our jobs, what are they called? Well, I've been dropping some key terms in here so that you know that it's not just in one department, and the term scientist can be used in many different jobs. So we have a lot of jobs that are centered around scientists helping scientists. And in fact, 75% of our jobs require a degree of some sort in science or engineering. This is really cool because, again, going back to how we're a lot of geeks who like to geek out about science. But we do want that focus on developing and providing innovative and, again, products that are going to help us keep our doors open and different services that will enable life science discoveries. The other piece that, as you're kind of looking at all of these different job categories, you'll see some overlap between them. And that also means you might be moving between departments. That is great for a new employee because, as I said, you might not end up in the spot you thought you would be, and it could be leading to something different. If you're like me and you start in sales and you move into HR, I would never have thought of applying to a job in HR as a scientist because that seemed crazy. But turns out HR has a lot to do with helping make sure the business moves forward because we're only as good as the people we have in those roles. And the people we have in those roles need to have scientific backgrounds. So of course we're hiring people to do the hiring who understand the science. And that's just an example of the interconnectedness of all of these departments. So when you are looking at different jobs, understand that science, R&D is a great place for science to happen. And it's not the only place where you can see a science knowledge really help accelerate your career. So look for different key terms in jobs from across these categories. And I heavily encourage you when you're doing informational interviews to try and hit some different departments at a company to figure out what actually gets you excited about working there, because it might not be the first place you thought you would look.
Yeah, so I think it's important to kind of break down. I know that last slide with all of the different departments, it can look a little bit overwhelming. So figuring out, okay, how do I simplify this? How do I make this job searching process a little bit easier? And I think broadly, especially at STEMCELL, we kind of talk about jobs as either being at the bench or away from the bench. So you can use your science in multiple different ways, but what you spend the majority of your time doing, that's really kind of the important thing to think about what you actually want to do. If when you're doing your graduate degrees, you're going through and saying, you know, I love being in the lab, I don't want to step away from the lab, then a bench type role might be more appropriate. And then looking at the other side of things, if you really enjoy the presentations, if you enjoy communicating your science, if you enjoy networking with other people at conferences, all of those kind of things might suggest that you might enjoy something away from the bench a little bit more. So as Christine kind of mentioned, there's a couple different areas where you can look for those types of jobs, and it's not always titled scientist. So the R&D is kind of, by and large, where most people kind of think when they think about careers at the bench. So these are specific teams with areas of expertise in kind of broad groups, things like immunology, neuroscience, things like that. And there's various scientist levels, technicians, and trainees. So we don't just hire PhDs into these types of roles. We really want to encourage the growth of people within their kind of bench careers as well. So these are highly collaborative, and they're focused on the development of technologies and protocol optimization. On the other side, there are also opportunities to work mainly at the bench in departments like process development, quality control, and manufacturing. So these are responsible for developing and implementing reproducible methods for large-scale manufacturing. They really do require a strong technical background and lab skills, and these are integral parts of the company as well. Then when we're talking about careers away from the bench, these can look like a lot of different things. There are a myriad of different jobs that are available here. Things like product management, business development, marketing, human resources, like what we are doing here today, sales, business ops. But I think the important thing to realize too is that we do realize that once you come into an industry job, you might not have formal experience in all of these. There are different levels as well. And for a lot of these jobs, we do have entry kind of opportunities where we really do invest in the training there as well. So if you're interested and passionate about some of these, I'd really encourage you to use those informational interviews to gain some of that information prior to applying. And here's kind of a snapshot of a couple different areas, similar to what we had talked about earlier. Regulatory affairs is another one on there that I didn't mention. But yeah, there's a lot of opportunities that you can get involved in different ways across the product development lifecycle. And really just going into your job search with an open mind is really key. And then putting your research into action. So how do you get started networking? This is really important, especially when you're going into things like the career fair at TMM. Looking at how you maximize the value in your networking plan really comes down to networking with intention. These informational interviews that you've conducted are great examples of focused intentional networking, focusing on the quality over the quantity of connections, keeping track of who you've talked to, interesting points of conversation, where you may have met someone, being strategic and specific when reaching out to people, especially via social media. So what we had talked about earlier with going into these informational interviews with questions prepared, having done some research on who you're talking to, that really helps them help you. So making sure that you're being creative and looking for these new avenues to meet people. You might have them in your network already, or you might need an introduction. These things might take time. So starting early in your job search process in networking is definitely something that will help you in the long run. And just kind of in summary here, some things kind of keep in mind when you're networking at a conference or a job fair. Looking at your list of companies that you would be interested in working with. Will they be attending a booth? Will experts in the field be giving a talk that you can attend? Keeping in mind job titles of interest that you've identified. Looking at the presentation schedule, identifying if there's any representatives from the company that will be attending or speaking. And then that final piece that I really do want to touch on, helping your connections stay in touch. So we've mentioned it a couple times. A lot of people, a lot of scientists in industry are very active on LinkedIn, which is not always something that you think about when you're going through your academic career. So brushing up your LinkedIn, having business cards, there's great electronic ones these days too. These are all really important tools to help keep that connection and build that relationship rather than just a check mark on the list. So with that, I will stop screen sharing here, and I will maybe get one of these questions that we had submitted prior to the job fair.
This is a good reminder to please use the chat function. I can see we've got a couple questions in there as well. So please start to put some questions in there, and we'll try and address those as well.
Perfect. I'll jump in and say thank you very much, Tianna and Christine, for that great talk. And I think you're going to address some of the questions that were submitted through the registration form first, and then we'll take some live questions, either by people raising their hands or submitting them in the Q&A box.
And I hope we answered a few of these questions as we were going through the presentation as well, which is why I'm glad we took a little bit more time. I'll ask this one to Christine. I like this one. Are there advantages or disadvantages to entering the job market with a master's as opposed to a PhD?
That's a great question, because you might have noticed here today when you looked at Tianna's profile is that, you know, we hire a lot of PhDs, we hire a lot of MSCs, we also hire a lot of bachelors. It depends on what you're looking to use that degree for. Having done a PhD, my recommendation to anyone who's looking at that, don't do that just because it's going to get you a better job. You need to really want to do that PhD. And you also need to look at what you're hoping to use it to bring you towards. I look at it of, could I have my job today without a PhD? Yes. But my PhD helped accelerate my career because I was able to use it at STEMCELL in a different way than I thought I would be able to. Where we usually look at it of people with PhDs may in R&D be applying for a job like a scientist, because that degree program may have directly trained you for that role. Now, that being said, of course, when we hire a scientist, we're looking for something very specific, and usually something that's bringing in a different skill set that we don't already have here on site. So if you've been doing your PhD using a lot of stem cell tools, just keep that in mind, that we're usually looking for somebody to bring us to a new workflow solution. At the same time, we have examples of scientists who came in with their bachelor's and have grown their career up at STEMCELL. And it just depends on where you want to spend your time. If you come into industry and you're like, you know what, I'd rather have a job with some job security and, let's be honest, not play the grant funding cycle, that may be a better path for you. There's not one answer because it's a very personal question, and there's never just one path that's going to work for everyone. So that's where I always feel that that question needs to be a really personal one about where do you want to spend your time and what are you intending to use your degree for? Because for better or worse, MSc, PhD are not necessarily the same as getting, you know, dental degree, that you need it to look at teeth.
It's a great analogy.
First one that popped into my head today.
Great. It's early out here on the West Coast. Awesome. So there's another question that had come in before on whether a basic research focused PhD can translate into industry. And I think that's the message that we really wanted to emphasize here today too, is that industry research is typically centered around a product. That has to happen, a product, technology, or a service. There has to be something that is available for selling at the end of it. Whereas academic research can be a little bit more of the basic knowledge building. That being said, it's not that knowledge building research doesn't happen in industry, it does. But I really think it's about packaging your experience and maybe putting a different spin on it. So understanding what the role is asking for and how have your experiences helped prepare you. So those transferable skills, really, really important in helping you sell yourself and presenting the best version of yourself to when you're applying for jobs. What's the other one? Christina, I'll let you take it.
I think I see a couple, and I've seen this in the Q&A as well, the timeline. How early should we start the job search? When should we be looking for jobs? Again, that's a little bit variable. The straightforward answer is if you're graduating from a bachelor's or a master's where you know that end date, I usually tell people 2 to 3 months before is probably when you're looking for postings. And some of that is because a lot of those jobs, we also need to fill within a couple months. We aren't looking for people a year or two out. But as we were also talking in this presentation, the job search starts a long time before you apply for roles, particularly if you are coming in with an advanced degree. So I usually tell people that, by the 6 months before your defense date, so if you have solidified your defense date, you should definitely be doing some job searching. And because by the time you solidified your defense date, you probably don't want to spend all of your time doing a bunch of extra research projects. You should. So the 6-month mark is usually the time frame that I recommend people have at least started to work with. But informational interviews, I wish I had started them a long time sooner. Probably wish I had started them right around that time, when you're doing your comprehensive exam, where you're like, should I continue with this? Do I actually want to continue with this? That's probably a good question mark to figure out what your next steps are, and to treat it as a fun project to figure out what are science jobs, so that you don't just continue with the assumption, because most people are used to the academic pathway, that you are going to do a postdoc and you must go along that prescribed pathway. You have some options. That's my recommendation in that front.
Did you have any more questions from the registration form, or should we ask a few from the Q&A box?
Why don't we ask a few from the
Yeah.
Q&A box, and then we'll jump back into the registration form, because there's a lot of great questions in there.
Perfect. Yeah, it doesn't look like anybody has their hands up, but I just saw this one that I thought was interesting. Can either of you comment on ways to make resumes more industry oriented as compared to academic? And I know that might be a long answer, so are there any resources where they could find more information regarding this?
That's a great question. There are a lot of great resources for making resumes more action-oriented, and I would heavily recommend looking at some tools like that. And what I'm talking about is making a true resume and not an academic CV, because that's usually the difference we see. A CV is where you dump everything you have done and you put all your academic papers, and it's a great exercise to keep track of everything you're doing. And then you need to convert it into a resume where you're like, yes, here is the example of I did this paper, but the paper is actually proof that I did something different. And I was trying to address a particular question, and here was the direct outcome of that question. That's how a resume should be formatted. And there's a lot of online tutorials. I probably don't even direct to one. I would probably look at several different formats, because there isn't just one way to do a resume. But the true answer to that is, it's not just a format. It's those informational interviews to figure out, how do I turn my skills into something that's going to get industry excited? Some of that is the terminology. You may be looking at things like a medical science liaison, and then you need to understand some of the regulatory language. And if you have any experiences that would translate into that, in order to really sell yourself as fully as you should in a resume. And it might even help you to figure out, what additional trainings do you need to prepare for if you do happen to get the resume that gets you the interview. So that's what I usually recommend, that you just take the time to do that extra research.
Excellent. I also see one that might be particularly relevant for the career fair setting. Could you give some tips on business cards, such as how to prepare them, what to put on them, and etiquette for giving them out?
I love business cards. I really do. But I like them in a couple different formats. So, I mean, when I did my first business cards, the way that I did them is that I also had if I had a poster presentation, I had a QR code that would link to my resume or my LinkedIn. And that's a great option for, someone can point and shoot. We want to make it as easy as possible to contact you after. So I think business cards really having same way that you would on a LinkedIn profile, having a headline or summary that tells people what you're about, what you've done, and then your contact information. Keep it simple. Do not overcomplicate a business card. It's really just a tool, and it should be something that just helps you keep that transaction and that relationship building going after the career fair. It's not a here's everything I've done, similar to a resume and a CV. Yeah, business cards, definitely dependent. Some people love them, some people hate them. Some people just throw them in a drawer and they never see them again.
I think that's a really good point, that this is where they sometimes need to complement your other ways of getting in contact. Personally, everybody handing you a resume at a career fair, I used to travel a lot to career fairs, and then I'd be like, sweet, I have 2 boxes of resumes. Am I actually going to bring these back? Or the people that did hand me QR codes and connect on with me on LinkedIn, that became a lot more feasible than expecting me to do the work and bring all the resumes back. So just keep that in mind, that especially when you are at a career fair, sometimes the people there, they're going to be meeting a lot of individuals. So you want to make it as easy as possible for them to remember you, and not dependent on them remembering to bring a bunch of pieces of paper home.
There's another one here that might be difficult to answer, but I saw it on the registration form and then again here. So if you're in an interview or even an informational interview and somebody throws out a really broad question, like, why should I hire you? Do you have any tips on how to answer that type of question?
That's a tricky one, but I mean, some of that's your chance to let your personality come through. And it's also a chance for you to sometimes ask some follow-up, that, you can be like, why should you hire me? Well, because I love doing XYZ and here's why I've done them. Is there anything you would like to zone in on and talk about more thoroughly? You can ask questions, especially if you are needing some more clarification.
Yep. There was another one from the registration form that I thought was really interesting, because both of you have worked in that recruiter role, and somebody was wondering how to handle an early stage interview that would be with somebody like a recruiter or a hiring manager, if you have any tips and tricks to pass that initial interview stage.
Well, I think that this is to remember that you are dealing with people at every stage of the process. And the biggest mistake we sometimes see people do is they assume this is just an HR screen and you don't need to care. In fact, every stage of the interview is a chance for you to sell yourself, and to remember that a lot of companies are looking for people who are collaborative and aren't making assumptions that different people are worthy of their time. Those first interviews are often the most important. And I'm just putting it that at STEMCELL, when you say meeting with the hiring manager, that's usually the pivotal point, because that's the person you'd be working with. And so if you treat that as they're a more junior staff member, so it's more important I impress the higher ups, that's not necessarily true, because the decision on whether they want to work with you possibly comes down to those first interviews. So take your time, try and connect with people, do your research going in. Most people do have some background. You want to make sure you at least know the names of people you're working with, and try and go in there with genuine interest about what they're doing, because they may be able to give you some insights into, again, where this job could be leading.
I think preparing for that too, right? You might be going through a lot of different job applications at once, maybe doing a lot of these kind of first interviews, but just making sure that right before you take, 10 minutes just to prepare your thoughts. Okay, what's this company? What are they about? Those kind of things are really important to make sure that you're doing right before the interview as well, so that you come into that phone call or that interview prepared and you know what you're talking about as well.
We probably have time for just 1 or 2 more questions. I don't see any new ones popping up in the chat box. Did you guys have any questions from the registration form that you wanted to answer? Otherwise, I can pull one out.
Oh, I see one. Should publications be listed on your CV? Now, this is a great one because we get this all the time, and I love that the wording was CV versus resume. I am a big advocate of you should, again, CV is where you put everything, and you should customize it for each application as a resume that is relevant to the job that you're applying to. I know it takes more time, but then you're showing you actually want that job and you're not just throwing the information out there. So should your publications be on there? It depends. Do those publications show, are they proof of some sort of the work you have done? So sometimes great resumes will be like, yes, I worked on this project and the outcome was this, this, and this. Again, resultant or as shown in these publications. And you just highlight some key publications. So again, they need to be used as proof that you had done something rather than just a dumping ground, which likely means that all your publications will not be listed on a good resume, but the ones that are targeted will be. And in fact, then, you know, you can put at the end, if you want to see the rest of my publications, they're up here on ResearchGate, or here's Google Scholar link to all of my publications, because it will do it for you.
I think you're on mute, Ellie.
Thanks. I see one last one here that I wanted to bring up, because I'm assuming a lot of people will be bringing their resumes to the career fair. And I know we've already talked briefly about these, but do you guys have any top mistakes that you see people make with their resumes, things to avoid?
I'm going to be honest, the biggest mistake I see is the generic resume that you don't hone in on the role. And why that usually ends up working is it means if you make a mistake in one, you perpetuate it in a bunch. We see resumes with the wrong company name on it. Typos, things like that are pretty quick shutdowns. So, you know, to the points we've been making, if you're doing networking with intention, you definitely need to follow that through with the resume and make sure you are being intentional about your resume. That's the biggest mistake. I don't know. We could talk at great length about some of the fun typos and interesting statements we've seen made in them. The other one I would also put, don't lie on your resume. Don't embellish. If you can't actually back it up, you're not doing yourself any favors, because unfortunately part of the interview process usually is to dig into those things. So if you are saying you're an expert in something, make sure you have the data to back that up.
Yeah, I think like what we had said about tailoring resumes as well. Maybe you are looked at that company list, you've seen who's coming at that career fair. Tailor some resumes prior to, bring a couple different versions if there are different types of jobs that you might be interested in, having a look at their career site prior to the fair. All of these things will help you actually make a good impression and show that you're really interested in that company and not just tossing out your resume as well.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. Unfortunately, we don't have time to address any more questions. Thank you both for your time today, and thank you everyone for attending. I put a link to the post-event survey in the chat. If you had any burning questions that you really wanted to get answered and we weren't able to address them, feel free to put them in that post-event survey and I can pass them on and we can try and get you an answer. If you're desperate for that answer, we can try and address those there. And thank you again for being here. Thank you to both our speakers. And I hope to see as many people as possible at TMM for the Career Connect event. So thank you very much and have a great day.